Welcome to Drive Through on US Modernist Radio. Between our regular podcasts, Drive Through has you meet interesting people, hear about great houses, and discover the rich history of modernist architecture, all in about 10 minutes, with your host, the man Dwell magazine called the Lorax of Modern Houses, George Smart.
I'm George Smart, and I am back up in the dressing room, having survived the boys' restroom on the lower floor, and I'm talking now with Carl Abbott, FIA, who worked with Paul Rudolph back in the day and has been a central part of Sarasota Architecture Foundation's renaissance of making this area's architecture known to the state, the nation, and the world. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you.
Now, tell me how you first encountered Paul Rudolph.
Well, I was a student at the University of Florida in the late 50s, and Paul Rudolph, if you were in an architectural school, you could not know Rudolph. He was the best, one of the couple of best-known architects in the world in the late 50s. So that's how I knew about him. And then I was working, then after that I worked at the end of the Paul Rudolph office here in Sarasota. And then after a few years, I was in his master's class at Yale. So I was a student of Paul Rudolph and finished in 1962.
And there were a number of other well-known architects that were in that class.
Yeah. In our class, there were only 15 in the class. Rudolph made a real point to have very small classes. He referred to them as his little United Nations. He had usually around 7 or 8 Americans, about that many people from around the world. And he made a real point. He said, you'll learn more from your fellow classmates than you will from us, from me, or any of your staff, or the staff, or any of the professors that come here to teach. And we did. He was right. And in our class were 2 of the best-known architects in the world today, Norman Foster and Richard Rogers. They're both lords.
Yes.
They were my closest friends in the class. And Richard's first wife, Sue, was part of the 4. The 4 of us were together almost always. And we traveled. We did projects together. We went for like semester break. We went to Taliesin to see Wright's work. And then at a later time, I worked in their first office in London.
Wow.
So we were good friends, and we saw a lot of each other and a lot of architecture. As Norman says, we scoured out architecture all around America together, and we did.
So you were not just chasing Rudolph houses, you were looking at all good examples of architecture around the world.
Well, in America at that time, and then independently we did Europe. I did Europe on my own, but not with either of them, but after I'd worked with them. But yes, American architecture. If Wright was has always been a great hero of mine, and so I wanted them both to know Wright's work. And today I saw Richard a couple of years ago in London, and Richard says, that trip has changed my whole view of architecture, and Wright is my hero. And before that, they had both said, both Norman and Richard had said, Wright is like last century. You know, we're in another century. And I kept saying, what have you seen of Wright's? And they both seen the Guggenheim. I said, the Guggenheim is like, it's about a 4 on a 5 of a scale of 10 plus. You've got to see the real stuff. And so we went to Chicago and went to Taliesin and we went to Falling Water with the snow up to our armpits.
Sure,
it was like an experience. I had done this a few years earlier when I was at the University of Florida. I got a small scholarship, and I'd done this on my own. So I had a foot up, as it were, in having gone to these places before. But it was so much better with them because if we wanted to get into a building or house or whatever, I would be very quiet, and Sue would go to the door with her great English accent and say, we're 4 English students of architecture who've come to see your house. And we would get into everything.
That's amazing.
It was amazing. It was an amazing trip. It was like a week long of sleeping on floors in people's apartments. And, you know, anyway, it was a great experience and an eye-opener for all of us.
Now, in getting Richard Rogers and Norman Foster familiar with Wright, similarly, how is America getting refamiliar with Rudolph now?
You're asking several questions. I mean, my head is going several directions when you ask that question. But first of all, America, as most people know, in architecture went through the doldrums, I refer to it as, with postmodernism, when almost all the buildings and all the shopping centers were like Hollywood sets. You expected to see the dinosaur coming around the corner, or the knight in armor coming around the corner. It was ridiculous. It was like facades of everything stuck on buildings. And that became so popular in America back in the 70s and 80s, America specifically, but in the world, but mainly America, that many very powerful, important architects were ignored. really ignored. And Rudolph was one of those. And Rudolph wound up being highly respected and recognized in Asia, so he got a lot more work there. Now, the pendulum is swung back again, as it does with most things. And there is a great awareness of the integrity of architecture and really thorough and true architecture. And that's what Rudolph was a champion of, total champion of that. So there is a whole other awareness of Rudolph's work and his importance. And I want to add to this, it's not just Rudolph's architecture, but it's Rudolph's great legacy as an instructor, as a teacher. He was a powerful, powerful instructor. 15 people in the class. He spent personal time with every student every week. We were with him, and we could see him more often if we wanted. Not like many deans of architectural schools who are there once a month, or you may never have even seen them. He was at the board with us and pushing us. He pushed us, and Norman and I have talked about this a number of times. He pushed us to things we never knew we could do. And he would challenge us. And he was an architect, of course, and still doing important projects. This is back in the early 60s. But we weren't copying him. He didn't want us to copy him. And he would push us to go our own direction. And so I think a lot of Rudolph's legacy is his students, what he's done. And some of those have gone on to teach and certainly to do some of the important buildings that are being done in the world today. But then the reflecting back is Rudolph himself, that these other very important public works architects are doing work. And let me just mention a few major projects. The airport in Beijing,
yes,
by Rudolph student. The airport in Hong Kong, Rudolph student. The amazing airport in Madrid, Rudolph student. The new Bloomberg headquarters in New York and in London. The new Apple headquarters in California, certainly. A Rudolph student. And probably topping it all is for the European Space Agency, the first building on the moon is being done by a Rudolph student.
Really? Who is that?
Lord Dormis Foster.
Okay.
You look it up in the web. It's there. It's all over the place on YouTube. But and it's still, as of 3 or 4 weeks ago, it was there as an active project, and it still is. I saw the modeling when I was in Norman's office a couple of years ago, and that was not the major project. It was a big one, but he had much bigger, huge projects he's doing. He's doing a whole city in Saudi Arabia. Anyway, but these are Rudolph students, and these are people who would have not been doing, and I'm talking about public work specifically right now, they would not be doing these work without Rudolph's having pushed them so hard, pushed us so hard. And there are a lot of other architects. Charles Gwathmey, Robert Stern, who does a totally different kind of work than Rudolph's. But he was a Rudolph student. He was dean at Yale at this point. For the last 12, 13 years, he's been dean. So Rudolph's legacy is not just his own work, but his students.
The people he influenced.
Yes. Yes. It's very powerful.
What shifted Rudolph out of academia to take up just strictly private practice?
Let me just say, he never left the private practice. When he was a professor, he was still fully active as a professor. I mean, as an architect, sorry. But he never left architecture. In fact, I think from the time he was probably about 16 or 18, he was an architect till he died, every day until he died. In fact, I was just talking to one of the people at the seminar, and they said right until the couple of days before he died, he was working on projects. So Rudolph was always that. Rudolph, I feel, no one's ever asked me that, what got him into teaching. Rudolph was a very, very intense human being, and his students, I think, became his family. Now, all students didn't make it. I mean, some of the students were asked to leave the class, period, asked to leave Yale. Some were put to do another couple of years and would leave, and some people found it just too intense and just left. So it was not an easy process being a student of Rudolph's, and you knew if you did it, it was going to change you.
Yes.
And it did. I mean, there was no question about that. But he loved to work with people who respected his challenges, and he would challenge you. Again, not to do his work. And he would come to your board, for example, and say, okay, when we talked a few days ago, we were talking about 2 or 3 directions on this project, and I thought maybe you should follow this one. What are you following? And you'd say, well, no, I decided to go this one. He'd say, well, tell me why. And show me how it's working for you. And then somebody say, great, keep going. Now I want you to carry this layer into that project and see how far you can go with that. And it was like helping you go through these roadblocks, as it were. And it was just amazing. And he was opening doors, in a way that I had never experienced, So he was a powerful teacher. And it wasn't just that he was a teacher sitting alone. He was a teacher who was a professional working full-time. His whole life was that.
As Rudolph buildings are under threat or being destroyed around the country, as a colleague of Rudolph and as a preservationist yourself, what do you think are some of the best strategies for keeping these buildings around?
Oh, God, that's a really hard question, because I worked with a number of really, really good people, an ex-mayor, an ex-head of school board, people who have been in very powerful positions here in Sarasota to help save Riverview High School. That was Rudolph's building that was destroyed about, 8 years ago. And we worked for 3 years, very, very heavy on that. And it was destroyed with a vote of 3 to destroy and 2 to save. So it was that close a vote. And all kind of things happened in the politics of the very end that swayed it to the negative. I was asked by the World Monument Foundation to come to New York to talk about preservation because of Riverview, and they had given a lot of money to help us preserve the building and to challenge the authorities to save the building. And I didn't want to do this, first of all, because it was so painful. It still is to talk about that. And I came up with several things that I did talk about there, and I think it's still valid. I haven't talked about this in about 5 or 6 years. But one is public awareness. The public, not all the local architects, but the public, the mom and pop and the kids, get those people aware of what this can be for you and make them realize, encourage them to realize that what you like is usually what your grandfather liked, not what your father liked. I mean, that's kind of a huge human attribute. We go back at least one generation to what we like and don't like.
Yes.
So if you don't like it, think of your children. Think of saving this for your children. So that's one strategy. Another is you've got to have finances. You have to have money to do this. You have to hire attorneys in most cases, and that's expensive. And you've got to have a lot of volunteers, like a number of us professional, and the ex-city mayor, the past city mayor, and others who gave an enormous amount of time. You've got to have people who are dedicated, who care about the legacy of their community and the country. So it's dedicated people. I'm mixing them. I'm not a good person for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 like Rudolph was. But I'm saying, number one, you've got to have an awareness, okay?
Yes.
And then you have to have great volunteers. You have to have some money, and you have to have time. You have to have time to get all these things working. Riverview, it happened so quickly, and then it dragged on forever. It didn't drag on for 3 years. It started, they were going to tear it down within months when we first heard about it. And so it got dragged on by us with the hope that we could save it. And we did not.
But you did save Sarasota High School.
Yes, and that's a whole nother dilemma. And I'm not going to go into all the details on that. But we saved part of that building. We didn't save all of it. And Rudolph would be very upset if he saw what was saved. I mean, he would love the fact that we saved the exterior, but he would be more than upset about what's happened to the interior. That's gone, totally gone. And that was, I would say, both. See, Rudolph was a spaceman about internal space, and that's lost except for that amazing atrium. But with that project, it came up that first of all, they were going to tear it down after having told us in writing that they would save it if Riverview went. But in the heat of all that, it was never fully listed. What does that mean, save it?
Right.
Yes, the exterior has been saved. There are many things that are not correct on that. And I would put it an average retrofit, okay? It's not at all what I'd call a top quality restoration, the exterior even. It's wonderful that the shell of the building is there. It's not all like it originally was, but it's there. And in another 30 or 40 years, it'll be a great project for someone to really restore that interior. There's this awful wall, black wall, 6 foot high, of kind of a screen in the middle of the big space, the big atrium. And that's a security thing. But why it's black and a very decorative pattern, it could have been glass, it could have been anything. We went through a stage in school design in America 30, 40 years ago where all schools were to be no windows. I don't know if you know that.
No.
But there was a definite move in all of America, no windows in schools. That had nothing to do with safety. It was for the kids to concentrate on their studies, for the kids to have, to air condition better, because when air conditioning was really coming in. And they found that was a huge psychological problem for kids to be put underground, in effect, put in bunkers. So that was all dropped. And then jump again, all in reference to Sarasota High. After 9/11, people were saying we couldn't do another high-rise. No more high-rises in the world. That was big discussion. Most people don't remember that, but that was a big discussion. And I was asked that many times at talks, and I would say, well, what's the option? If you do a hole in the ground, you've still got one entrance. You've got a gunner position to be done in, So it's having to do with learning, teaching, making people aware of safety. We're all vulnerable. We're human beings. And the thing with schools right now, the school design of America today is basically a prison. You'd have one entrance, and you'd lock the kids in. I mean, what happens if a gunner is in the middle of the school, like has happened?
Right.
The kids can't get out. They're captured. So I think this whole philosophy of the school with the one door as a lock is doomed to die pretty soon. And when that happens, hopefully, the security that's very objectionable, the way it's done at Sarasota High School, will be rethought in a way in which the building will then really be the space it should be. Now, that's the atrium. The interior is destroyed right now, but it could be rebuilt.
Well, Carl, thank you so much for spending time with me and for everything that you're doing down here in Sarasota.
Thank you for interviewing us, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, you bet.
Visit us on the web at usmodernistradio.org for links about people and buildings mentioned today. Our theme song is performed by Robinson Earl. US Modernist Radio and Drive-Thru is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of residential design. I'm Tom Guild. Thanks for listening to Drive-Thru from US Modernist Radio.